right, we're joined now by Faith Mabera, who is a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, to share her opinion on some of these developments. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for talking to us. We'll talk about the vote and who voted how in just a moment, but some interesting reports that we're getting that post that South Africa's abstention from the vote, we had the US President Joe Biden reportedly calling South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa to have a powwow tear over South Africa's actions. And of course, we know this is the third time that South Africa has, as we've heard through our international relations minister, maintained its independence on this issue.
Yes, thank you for having me. I think it's important, and like you're saying, just before we get to the vote, South Africa's position for me was telling in a number of ways. Firstly, if you look at the explainer of the vote by the Deputy Permanent Representative of South Africa to the UN, it was clear that South Africa wanted to maintain this idea of neutrality and this stance of neutrality, particularly because they felt that it was important that the Human Rights Council remains a place where the processes respect impartiality and neutrality. And you had those very, I think, quite clear statements from Minister Pandor, who was saying that we need to avoid selectivity when approaching this issue. And perhaps also an added point to South Africa's position was that when you look at also other violations of gross and systematic violations of human rights by other countries, it needs to also receive the same level of attention that this situation has received, and that has not been the case historically speaking. For instance, she alluded to the case of what's been happening in Gaza and how that situation has seemed to elude the swift action that we've seen in this case. So this is, I think, a very interesting and valid point by South Africa in terms of backing up its stance. But also, I think the other important thing that we need to bring into context when understanding also South Africa's position, and perhaps many more of the countries that abstained and even those that voted against the decision to suspend Russia, it's also the question about due process. And by due process, I mean the idea that there is a process where there's a commission, international commission of inquiry that was appointed and tasked with following up and digging up critical evidence and in a systematic manner to actually account and build up a case about the gross violation of human rights. So South Africa felt that in moving to this decision to suspend Russia, there was almost a view that the process had been rushed along, that it hadn't. The process had. There's almost a sense that the UN Human Rights Council was skipping ahead and prejudging the outcomes of this commission of inquiry. So and they felt that this would set a very tricky sort of precedent for similar processes where there's inquiries and investigations as part and parcel of the process of investigation. So that's speaking largely to South Africa's position. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the South Africa's position of neutrality also stems from, I think, a very considered view of its outlook on the situation and its continued insistence also on diplomatic solution and the respect for the multilateral rules order. So it's a way of almost not wanting also to be caught up in the back and forth and the recriminations between those who are pro-Russian and those who are anti-Russian. You can walk a neutral position, and you can also defend the rules-based order. And I think that's what South Africa is showing.
And this is what I want to understand about the role of not only the UN General Assembly. We'll talk about the Security Council in just a moment, which essentially the Ukraine is asking for, that Russia be booted off that as well. But the UN General Assembly, I want to know the tools it has at its disposal, because what South Africa and countries like Senegal, India and Brazil are saying, there is a need for the multilateral body to engender diplomacy through dialogue. And just looking at its statutes that it has available to it, what measures does it have to apply quote-unquote punitive measures while promoting peace? Because I'm wondering if you have to, if you have a security such as you have to have 2/3 votes in order to have something approved, how much does that help ensure fairness, if there is such a term?
Okay, so I think it's important here to separate the various bodies. So let's not conflate what the mandate of the Human Rights Council is. And in this case, the 2/3 rule applies specifically when you're talking about the 2/3 rule in terms of its 47 member council of the Human Rights Council, of which Russia was a member. And I think when you look at it in terms of this particular case, it's actually a historic, this vote to suspend Russia is historic on 2 levels. It's actually only the second time that a member of the Human Rights Council has been suspended under Resolution 60/125, paragraph 8, which suspends a sitting member of the Human Rights Council if it's been, there's been reports and allegations of gross and systematic violations of human rights. And just to give a background of that, the first time was Libya in 2011, when Libya was serving on the Human Rights Council then, and there were reports that the state forces under the Gaddafi regime were doing mass killing and leveraging indiscriminately killing civilians in Libya. So then a decision was taken to suspend Libya then. So this is now the second time. So it's historic in that case. But in answering your question, following, and here I want to also bring in a comparison, for instance, with what we saw last month, which was the decision in the General Assembly to condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So it's when you look at the Human Rights Council, I think this was important because it was almost set up as a way, there was a messaging value about ensuring that the UN sticks to the script in terms of and sticks to its mandate of showing up and promoting the human rights. So ensuring that its bodies stick to that very important mandate that it has. So it was important for it to send that message and also back up what was the earlier vote in UNGA in condemning Russia, and backing that up with the Human Rights Council decision to suspend Russia. So those two was seen to go almost hand in hand when you're looking at it from in terms of just the kind of rallying call in condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. So that's why you see almost a parallel movement across the UN bodies in this regard. So the question also about, so what is what you're asking? What happens? Is it a significant move? Is it something that we're going to see actually land a heavy punch to sort of deterring and compelling Russia to stop its aggression? That's what you're asking. And I think it's important to also understand that when we talk about how intergovernmental organizations work and how the whole virtue of multilateralism and diplomacy also filters into these situations of conflict, it's also important to understand that just the setup and the framework of the UN. Also, there's also the permanent members who sit on the UN Security Council, of which Russia is. So I think the fact that Russia, the pressure point in this point was also to back up alongside sanctions, which we've seen was also a punitive measure. It was important to also include almost a naming and shaming and condemnatory stance, which is what we've seen with the General Assembly and now with the Human Rights Council decision.
Faith, before we run out of time, because I want us to look at a very important point as well, because as you say, the US admits that there's very little that can be done in taking away Russia's veto power from the Security Council. President Biden also calls this suspending of Russia more symbolic, but he says it intensifies Russia's isolation after the assault on Ukraine. But looking at the vote, of the 193 members of the General Assembly, 93 voted in favor of the suspension. We had 24 that voted against, 58 that abstain. And the remainder, of course, did not participate. And some suggest that this is a weakening of international unity against Russia at the United Nations. Do you agree? And, you know, can we talk about punitive while at the same time we're talking about a peaceful resolution? Because Russia has vehemently denied these allegations around human rights abuses of Bucha, saying that, in fact, its forces had already left. President Zelensky, of course, is calling for Russia to be completely expelled from the UN Security Council. So I just want to understand, at what point does this multilateral institution use the legislation, statutes at its disposal to broker peace while not taking sides?
So that's it's a question also of, seemingly, like we're saying, it's a gray area, because on one hand you have a case can be made where Russia is saying that it's acting under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is the case of self-defense, and the question of also ensuring that it protects those of its kin in eastern Ukraine. So they are making that case. And when you look historically, there's also a lot of precedents set by that very notion. So they actually did the homework in terms of setting it, and giving it a legal fervor and a legal basis in that sense. And on the other hand, you have those of the viewpoint that this is aggression, and the fact that now it had to go to a vote, as we saw last month, and we saw the 141 voting against, means that by essence the majority see it as a violation of international law. So that's why you had that particular outcome. So it's a question also of the facts on the ground. It's a question of interpretation of international law and the multilateral rules order. And that's where we see also a very interesting case, for instance, being made by China, who voted against Russia's suspension and also abstained when we saw the UNGA vote last month. And it made the case that we need to be wary of just whose viewpoint of the international rules order are we taking? Are we taking the Western-led view and the US-led view of the international multilateral order, which sometimes has been prone to accusations of selectivity, or are we looking at it from a more objective? Is there even such a thing as a completely objective viewpoint? And I think that's where a lot of the clash of viewpoints seems to come about. Now, when you're asking about the question of negotiations, yes, in any situation of war, there is a need to try and bring belligerents to the table. And the point at which belligerents are willing to actually get to a compromise is when they get to a mutually hurting stalemate. Otherwise, the other option for war to end would be a decisive military victory. Those are the two outcomes, essentially, in a lot of armed conflict. So in this case, it's a matter of when you want to reach to a compromise, you also have to see what alternatives you have other than war. When there's a pressure point, and that's the purpose of sanctions, to actually impose costs of continuing your violent action. So that's where the punitive aspect of sanctions seems to be, and they were hoping that that would be the intended effect that it would have on Russia in terms of reconsidering and recalculating its need to prolong the conflict. So that's how the punitive go along with the diplomatic measures in trying to arrive at a resolution of the conflict. And that's determined also by the military balance of power on on the ground. So all those dynamics sort of play out in determining the unfolding and the unraveling and the trajectory of a particular conflict, in this case, an international armed conflict, as we've seen.
And of course, both sides have accused each other of the propaganda wars in the information highway. Unfortunately, we've got to leave it there. Faith Mabera, senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, thank you very much for sharing your views on this. And we're talking about a Russia nation being booted out of the Human Rights Council.